Ahoy hoy, this is Michaela from Team Retro, where we like retro games and we like the devices that bring them to us. So I've been spending the last couple of weeks of my free time trying to set up the Ayn Odin and optimizing it as best I could for retro gaming and emulation. And I previously made a setup guide for this device that will have gotten you up and running and gotten you started with RetroArch and some lower end emulation. So if you haven't checked out that video yet, I'll leave a link in the description for this video because this is part 2 of my 3-part Odin guide. And this guide will teach you how to set up the standalone emulators for more high-end systems such as 3DS or PS2. And so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go through each standalone emulator and configure the controls and get our ROM library set up. And then we will do a couple of little tweaks here and there to try and get the best out of our emulation experience for these higher end systems. We've got a lot of ground to cover in this video, so if you're only interested in setting up a specific emulator, I will have timestamps, so that way you can skip around and just set up the emulators that you want. Alright, let's do this. Let's jump in and let's get started. So to make things a little bit easier, I am using the Odin in docked mode with a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard connected. And the first emulator we're going to talk about today is Mupen64 Plus FZ, which is the Nintendo 64 standalone emulator. Now when you first enter the emulator, it's going to ask for permission to access files on the device. Go ahead and click Allow. And then we're going to go ahead and map our controls. So let's hit the hamburger menu on the top left and let's go to Profiles. And then let's go ahead and go into Controller. And then we're going to click the Settings button next to Android Gamepad and we're going to click Copy. Let's go ahead and name it. I'm going to name it Odin Gamepad, but you can name it whatever you want. Once you've named it and hit OK, it's going to actually create a new profile. And then from there, we're going to map our controls. Now, the controls are actually going to be mapped from the Odin gamepad. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to click on each button, and then we're going to unmap the controls first. So let's start with the L button here. First, we're going to click Unmap, and then we're going to map the key. And then you'll do that for all of your other keys. And for all of these standalone emulators, I'm actually using Retro Game Core's recommended setup, which is why I am mapping all of the keys in all of these standalone emulators. So I'll be sure to include a link to his written guide. He did a lot of good work on it, and make sure you also subscribe to his channel as well. Now I'm also going to map a key to access the menu, and I'm going to go down here to menu key, and I'm actually going to set that to Y because we aren't using the Y button for any controls on the N64 emulator. So it'll be a quick way to access the menu and reset or save states or switch out of games. I'm also going to set save state and load state to the L3 and R3 buttons. And that should be it. There are a couple of extra buttons you can set according to the Retro Game Core guide, but I'm going to leave everything else as is. Back in the main menu, we're going to go ahead and select Profiles and then select Profiles. Then we're going to change the Controller 1 profile to the Odin gamepad that we just configured. And that will set the Odin gamepad to the default. Now let's go ahead and navigate to our ROM files. Let's click Refresh ROMs, select Folder, and then we're going to navigate to the ROMs file on our Odin SD card that we set up in the last video. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to ROMs, and then I'm going to go to where my Nintendo 64 ROMs are and click Allow Access, and then Allow one more time. And the emulator will scan and download box art for all of your Nintendo 64 games. Now, the free version of this app does have ads, but you can spend about $3 or so to get an ad-free version of this emulator, so I do recommend that you do that. But for now, I'm just going to continue with the free version. So let's go ahead and fire up Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. And you could see here that the emulation looks kind of not right. It looks like it's repeating the same image twice on the right there. So let's actually close out of this and go back to our main menu in order to fix all this glitching that we're getting. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into Display, and we're just going to make sure our rendered resolution is 1440 by 1080. And then we're going to go back into Profiles and select Profiles. And for Emulation Profile, we're actually going to pick Glide N64 Very Accurate. This device should be able to handle this. And let's go back into Kirby 64, and you could see this actually looks really good and really sharp. And there doesn't seem to be any issue at all with lag or stuttering, maybe a little bit of a frame drop here and there, but overall this is a very good picture, and I've never seen Kirby 64 look this good before. Just for a quick comparison, here is Kirby 64 on a Nintendo Switch through the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service. And you could see the picture quality is still really good, and it is still very playable on the Nintendo Switch, but the Odin seems to inch it out just a little bit. And if I had to choose whether to play this game on the Switch or the Odin, I would probably pick the Odin. Alright, now let's go ahead and set up PlayStation 2 with the Aether SX2 app. And you'll have to go through an initial setup here, so let's go ahead and click Next from the tutorial screen. It will have you read an FAQ here. I do suggest that you read that and then go ahead and click Next. And the optimal/safe defaults are meant for a higher device like the Ayn Odin, so we're just going to go ahead and leave that as is. And you can do widescreen if you want, but I'm going to keep the auto standard 4:3 aspect ratio here. Now we have to import a BIOS file. And unfortunately, due to copyright, I can't tell you where to get a PlayStation 2 BIOS file. But once you do have it, you can go ahead and click the plus sign here to import your BIOS, and then you'll be able to navigate your Android device's file system. So for me, all of my BIOS files were on the SD card. So I just navigated to my BIOS directory, and I imported a couple of different BIOS files here, one from Japan, one from Europe, and one from the US, but I'm going to go ahead and select the USA one to be the default, and then I'm going to go ahead and click Next again. And then it will ask to select your game directory, so we're going to navigate to where our ROM files are. So for me, again, it's on the SD card, so I'm just going to navigate to my ROMs folder and then to my PlayStation 2 folder, and then I'm going to allow access to that folder so the emulator can read the ROM files. And then setup will be complete. It will scan the ROM directory, and you will have your ROM files accessible right through this emulator. Now again, we need to map our controls, so let's go up to the hamburger menu on the top left, and we're going to scroll down to controller settings. And from there, we're going to click port 1, and we're going to leave controller type to DualShock 2, and then we're going to go ahead and manually set up our bindings. And this is fairly easy to do because the Odin's control scheme is very similar to a PS2 controller, so just map everything accordingly and you should be good to go. Once you're done mapping port 1, we're going to go ahead and go into the hotkeys, and we're going to scroll down until we get to the Open Pause menu option. And it's a little bit further down, but once we get to that, we're actually going to map it to one of the back buttons behind the Odin. And that way, all we have to do is select one of those extra buttons, and we'll be able to open up our pause menu and get into our emulator settings. I mapped it here to the back left button. Then once you boot up a game, you're going to notice that the touchscreen controls are still on the screen. So we are actually going to need to do something to get those taken off. So once you've launched a game, go ahead and hit that pause button. You could either hit the pause button on the touchscreen, or you can hit that back button that we mapped earlier. And then let's go ahead and hit the controller icon on the top right. And where it says touchscreen controller view, we're just going to go ahead and set that to none. And then that's it. This emulator's all set up. So if you launch into a game, here's Ratchet and Clank, you're going to see that for the most part this game is playable, but there are some frame rate drops here and there. It's not perfect. And mostly you're going to see the audio stutter or slow down, and you're going to see the frame rate go down a little bit when there's a lot of action on screen, but if there are no enemies, it does tend to run at full speed. So the more you see on screen, the more this game is going to struggle. And that's the case with most PlayStation 2 games on this device. God of War 2 will experience very similar slowdown when there is a lot of action on screen. And even at a 1x resolution, this game will struggle a little bit, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's unplayable. It's just not a great experience. You can mitigate that a little bit by going into the menu and toggling the frame limiter, and what that'll do is that will make slowed down parts look a little bit faster, but then if there is no slowdown, it'll actually play the PS2 games a little bit too fast. So with a game like Ratchet and Clank, I left it turned off because otherwise there were certain parts where it seemed like the game was running in fast forward. But with something like God of War 2, things seemed to move at a better rate, and it actually seemed to improve the experience a little bit. If only just a little bit, it still didn't look like an optimal performance. However, there are a ton of tweaks that you can potentially do with this emulator to get better PS2 performance. I'm just starting to get into the weeds a little bit with PS2, so if you do have any suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Moving on to Citra, when you open it up for the first time, you are going to have to allow access to media on your device, so go ahead and click Allow. And then let's go ahead and add our ROMs folder to the library. So again, I'm going to navigate to my SD card and select my folder where I keep my 3DS ROM files. And once you do that, it will populate the emulator with your ROM list, complete with thumbnails that would have shown up on the 3DS as well. Now let's go up to the top right to the settings menu, the three dots, and we're going to click that and click Input Binding. And then we've been through this before. We're going to go ahead and bind our inputs to the Odin controller. There's nothing special to this setup. Just go ahead and set it to what it would normally be on the 3DS. Now you could optionally set the resolution to a 2x resolution, and the games will look a little bit sharper, but they may not necessarily run as good as you would expect. Also in the settings menu, I would turn new 3DS mode to on. I'm not 100% sure if this will actually impact performance, but some games won't work unless you have that turned on anyway, so there is no harm in actually setting that mode to on. So here's Kirby Planet Robobot running at a 2x resolution, and it looks pretty sharp. And there are some frame rate drops and stutters here and there, but this is definitely playable. This is not by any means a perfect experience, but it's also not a bad one either. So with this emulator, you're actually going to use the touchscreen to access the menu. Just swipe from the left. And if you click Edit Buttons, Toggle Controls, you can turn off all of the touchscreen buttons. Just touch them or click them all until they're red, and then go ahead and click Done. And now you are free to use the Odin buttons without the touchscreen buttons getting in the way. And while 3DS games are perfectly playable with this specific screen layout, you can also swipe to access the menu, and you can also change the layout to make the top screen bigger. And for a game like Metroid Samus Returns, playing this at a 2x resolution with this bigger screen layout actually looks really good because most of the action is going to be on the top screen, whereas you only need the bottom screen for the map and to change your beam powers, so this is completely playable like this. However, when it comes to 3DS emulation on this device, it is good, but not perfect. If you notice here in Pokemon Omega Ruby, the color textures for Mudkip are not prominent. All of his coloring is gone, and he just has this weird white color. Thankfully, this is an easy fix. You can go into the emulator settings and set accurate multiplication to accurate. And then once you've done that, go ahead and boot back into the game. And you'll see here that the colorization is back to normal. Just keep in mind this setting can make some of your games a little bit slower, but if you're running on the Odin Pro Snapdragon processor, you should be good with a good chunk of the 3DS library. And if a game is not running as expected, you can go ahead and drop it down to a 1x resolution, and then don't use the large screen setting. Keep it at the default, because at least then it will look like it does on a 2DS or a 3DS. With the only downside being is that you have a lot of screen real estate that is just going to be black borders. But when playing the Odin in handheld mode, that might not bother you, considering how compact the screen is. So it's really up to you to decide what you like better. Would you prefer better performance at the original resolution, or a higher resolution and bigger screen, but maybe some performance dips? And that's all going to come down to personal preference. I'm not going to give my opinion one way or another. It's going to be different based on each user. Moving on to Dolphin MMJR, things are going to seem very familiar at this point. We need to allow access to media, allow updates, that's personal preference. I usually just click OK. And then we're going to go ahead and navigate to where our ROMs are, very similarly to what we've had to do for the other standalone emulators that we've worked with. The only difference being that we have to do this for both Gamecube and Wii games. And the same thing goes for configuring our inputs. We have to configure for both a GameCube controller and a Wii remote. So we'll go to GameCube controller 1, we'll keep it at emulated, and once we do that, a window will pop up for us to map our buttons. And then we'll map our buttons accordingly. Again, I am using the suggested input from the Retro Game Core guide, but you can map these to whatever you feel comfortable with. And then we're going to do the exact same thing. Once we've configured GameCube, we're going to go back into that settings list and we're going to configure our Wii input. And again, we're going to select emulated, and then we're going to decide whether or not we're going to use a nunchuck. For me, I decided to use just the Wii remote itself, so for extension, I clicked none. But you can also set it to classic controller, and there's also some additional settings for guitar, drums, turntable, if you decided you wanted to play Rock Band or something. Whichever extension you select, go ahead and map the buttons, and then when you're done with that, we can go ahead and give some gameplay a try. And then once you actually load up a Wii game, you can actually hit the controller button and you can choose the controller layout that you want. So in this case, I'm going to select a horizontal Wii remote and the system will adjust for that. However, unfortunately with this game, I was trying to play Kirby's Return to Dreamland and it loaded in Japanese and then it immediately crashed afterwards, so I'm thinking this may be just a bad ROM. Once I booted into Kirby's Epic Yarn, everything seemed to be working properly. I set the Wii remote to sideways and it accepted my inputs just fine. And this is going to be a similar use case for the 3DS. There are some Wii games that will run very decent on this device, and Kirby's Epic Yarn is one of them. This is a charming little side-scrolling game, and the Snapdragon processor seems to be handling it pretty decently. However, as far as GameCube and Wii are concerned, you're not going to get consistent progress across the board. For example, with Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, there was quite a bit of slowdown and there was a lot of audio stuttering, which is kind of a shame because Sonic Adventure 2 Battle is my preferred version of this game, but if it came between this game and the Dreamcast version on the Odin, I would probably just opt for the Dreamcast version. And then on top of it, a few minutes into the gameplay, the game just completely froze on me. The music continued to play, but the game itself was just frozen and crashed out. But then you have a game like Wind Waker that runs at full speed consistently and seems to be doing very well. You may also get some subtle improvements if you use the PAL versions of GameCube and Wii games as opposed to US versions, because those will run at 50 frames per second instead of 60, and they might be a little bit more stable. Moving on to DS emulation with Drastic. This is a pretty straightforward standalone emulator. Let's go ahead and allow access for audio. And it's up to you if you want to put a shortcut on the desktop or not, but we already have a shortcut. In the settings, let's go to External Controller, and we're going to click Select Key Mapping and click No Mapping. And then let's go ahead and map controls, and then we're going to configure our controls just like we've done before. And then when we're done, let's go ahead and go into Map Special. And we're going to skip a lot of this. The only real thing that I'm interested in is Open Menu, and we're going to set a key binding for that. I'm actually going to use one of the back buttons because those are great for that. And then the only other hotkey that we're going to configure is going to be pointer down, and we're going to set that to R3. And then we're going to scroll down a little bit, and we're going to change right stick mode to pointer mode. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to use the right stick as the touchscreen pointer, and we don't have to use the touchscreen if we don't want to. And now that we've mapped the back button to access the menu, we could just click that to go into the menu during a game, and we could turn off the on-screen controllers just through a toggle. Also, while a game is running, I like to go into the menu and scroll down to Edit Screens and Virtual Pad, and then we're going to go to Landscape 1 by 1, and we're just going to center the two screens by going to Resize Screen, and we're just going to move them down a little bit just because I like them to be centered on the screen, not on the top of the screen. And then once you've done that, go to Back, go to Menu, and Save as Global Layout. And then we're going to go in again, and we're going to do Landscape X by 1, and we're just going to fix this a little bit. We're going to resize the screen again. We're going to move the top screen to the left a little bit, and then we're going to make this bottom screen bigger just so that we could see it and access it a little bit better. And I'm actually going to put it right on the center here so it looks more like a map screen. And depending on the game I'm playing, I will bounce back and forth between these two settings. For example, New Super Mario Bros. Actually looks very good with the X by 1 resolution. And you could take advantage of that bigger screen on the Odin, and it looks really good. All DS games should not give you a problem using the Drastic emulator. PPSSPP is another emulator that's pretty easy to configure. Again, let's go ahead and allow access to our device, and then we're going to go ahead and navigate to our PSP folder, which is on our SD card. So go to SD, hit the up button to go all the way back, and there you'll see the ROMs folder. So go ahead and navigate to that, and then navigate to where your PSP games are, and they will automatically show up. Now, as far as controls, you actually don't have to map anything. It's already set up for you. But you will want to do a couple of things here. Under graphics, we can go ahead and change this to a 3x resolution because the system should be able to handle it. And then under controls, we just need to take the checkbox next to on-screen touch controls and set that to off. And once you've done that, you're pretty much not going to have any issue with PSP games playing. The majority of the library is very playable at a 3x resolution. And Mega Man Powered Up is one of the easier games to emulate, but Outrun 2006 is actually harder to emulate, and this game seemed to do very well at the same time. We're still at a 3x resolution, and there is a little bit of hiccup here and there, but overall it seems to be pretty smooth gameplay. And here's the obligatory God of War test, and we don't have frame skip turned on, we're still at a 3x resolution, and yeah, we'll get an occasional stutter here and there, but for the most part, even this game runs very well. If the occasional stutters do bother you, you could turn this down to a 2x or a 1x resolution, but it won't be as sharp on the Odin as it looks now. And just keep in mind, I have an Odin Pro, so if you have an Odin Lite or an Odin that doesn't have a Snapdragon processor, your mileage may vary. Alright, let's set up Redream for Dreamcast emulation, and you'll end up with some of the same things that we've had to do with these standalone emulators. We have to add our ROM files, so we have to allow access, we have to navigate to where our ROMs are, and then the emulator will automatically populate the ROM list right on the main screen. And if you go into input, it actually automatically recognizes the Odin Xbox controller, and we already have our controls mapped appropriately. So we should just automatically be able to jump into some gameplay here. And all of the Dreamcast games that I tested worked just fine. Ikaruga ran without a hitch, but this one is very easy to emulate. This is usually the first game that I test, because I can get Ikaruga running even on a lower end device. But even Crazy Taxi 2 didn't give me a hard time at all. I had to cut the sound out due to copyright, but we did have this game running at full speed. And I still attest that I am terrible at Crazy Taxi games, but I still really enjoy playing them. So the only config that I did here was I went into the bind shortcuts area of the input section, and I set that to a back button on the Odin. Just because we've been using the back buttons to access the menus easier, so I figured this would be a good opportunity to do that in this emulator as well. Now, in my last video, we set up PS1 games to work on RetroArch, but you may want to actually consider using Duckstation instead. So let's map our controls and take a look. If we go into port 1, we can actually set our controller type to an analog controller, a DualShock, which I recommend. And then we can actually perform automatic mapping, and it automatically maps the controller to the Odin Xbox controller, and we don't actually have to do any button mapping here. It's already configured for us. But again, I went into hotkeys and set the pause menu to a back button on the Odin, because that's what I've been doing for all these standalone emulators throughout this video. And just like with Aether SX2, we have to put in a profile name, so I'm just going to put in Odin, and our controls are mapped, and we're good to go. And adding your ROM files is exactly the same as the other standalone emulators. We have to go to our SD card and navigate to where our ROMs are, and once we do that, it will automatically populate the emulator with our ROMs. And because we converted our PlayStation 1 files in the last video and we created M3U files, Duckstation automatically recognizes the M3Us and gets rid of all the extra clutter. So now let's go into the menu, and we're going to go into App Settings, and we're going to go into the Enhancements tab. And then we're going to set the resolution scale to a 3x resolution. And then when we start up a game, it's going to ask us to import our BIOS image. So we're going to have to navigate to our BIOS folder and we're going to have to import that as well. Then, of course, when you go to launch a game, the touchscreen controls are going to be present, so we're going to have to go into the menu to address that. So I'm going to hit that back button on the Odin that I mapped, and then we're going to go to touchscreen controller settings, and then we're going to go to add remove buttons, and then we're going to go ahead and just uncheck all of the buttons, and that will take them off of the screen. And then we have to go into change opacity, and then we just need to set that down to 0, and that will get rid of the D-pad, and we should be good to go. And I showcased Brave Fencer Musashi in my last video, but here it is running at a 3x resolution, and I was able to get my capture card settings figured out, so now you can actually enjoy the soundtrack of this game. And you could see here the pixels are just really crisp, and it looks a lot better than it did through the RetroArch core. So I'm going to let this play for a couple seconds just because I highly recommend this game, and if you have a retro device capable of PS1, including the Odin, you really should give this game a try. And just by comparison, here is the same game running through RetroArch. And you could see it just doesn't look as sharp. It is definitely playable, but you could see it's a lot more pixelated, and it is at a 1x resolution. There may be a way to up the resolution in the PPSSPP rearmed core, but I poked around RetroArch settings and couldn't find it, so if you know where to up the resolution on the RetroArch core, please let me know in the comments. Alright, we've covered a lot of ground, so we're gonna call it for this video. If you followed my last guide, you will have gotten your Odin Pro set up, and you will have gotten RetroArch configured. And now, after following this guide, you will have all your standalone emulators set up and ready to go as well. I have one more guide on the way for the Odin Pro, and that's going to be setting up front ends and comparing them so that you can ultimately decide how you want your front end experience to be presented. But until then, you can jump in and now enjoy some of these higher end systems on your Odin device. But that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions in the comments below. And please feel free to continue the conversation on the Budget Aquaman Discord. Link will be in the description. Again, thank you for watching, and if this video was helpful to you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.